Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, from now until the heat death of the universe, I am your host, Kyle. And today, I have a very exciting episode. Today's episode combines some of my favorite things. 1. Conservation and environmentalism. 2. Popular resistance. And 3. A giant fucking lake. Today, we talk Lake Baikal. I would be really interested to know how many of you are familiar with Lake Baikal. It's a very famous lake in Russia, and with people who just really like big lakes, real lakeheads, you know? But outside of Russia and the biggest of lakeheads, it's not really somewhere people think a lot about or know a lot about. So, for those of you who don't know, what is Lake Baikal? Well, at its core, it's a lake, and a big one at that. Even by square footage, it's a large lake. It's the 7th largest in the whole world. But that's not really what it's known for. Lake Baikal is the deepest lake on the planet Earth. Lake Baikal is, at its deepest point, almost 6,000 feet deep. It's something like 2 kilometers. That is incredibly deep. It is also the oldest lake on the planet as well. As you might imagine, from a uniquely deep and uniquely old lake, it has a very unique ecosystem. One of the things that makes the Baikal ecosystem so interesting is that it has its own very species of seal, which is, I don't know, it's kind of neat. You don't really think about freshwater seals all that often. And these seals, like much of the majority of the animal and plant life in Lake Baikal, are only found in Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal is pretty out there. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in Siberia, not far north of Mongolia, in a part of Russia that is incredibly sparsely populated. Out there is mostly wilderness, trees, and, well, the lake itself. But the lake helps with all of that. Lake Baikal is a big tourist destination for not just Russian citizens, but also people in all of Central Asia. And during the peak summer months, people from all over will visit the little towns around the lake. One of these towns is a town called Listvyanka. Fun fact, I've been to Listvyanka. I went in the off-season when the lake was still frozen and no one was there. And like any resort town in the off-season, hot damn, there was nobody there. But if you walk around the town, you can see the infrastructure there for a tourist population much, much larger than the actual resident population. But not only is the lake a big source of tourism, and as such a source of wealth and job opportunities for the people in places like Listvyanka, it's a beloved spot. It's a beloved natural feature of the Siberian wilderness. The people who live around Lake Baikal are very proud of the lake and care about its health and the health of its unique plants and animals that live there very deeply. And this is not really a new thing. The people who live around the lake have cared deeply for the lake for seemingly as long as there have been people to live around the lake. And an important thing to point out is the pride and love of Lake Baikal is not unique to the people who live near Lake Baikal. It's really interesting to think about considering how far away Lake Baikal is from so much of Russia, but the Russian people writ large care a lot about Lake Baikal. It is a very important natural image, a symbol of Russia, kind of like, say, the Grand Canyon for the United States. Even though it is incredibly far away from metropolitan Russia and is deeply seated within the vilified and looked down upon Russian East by a lot of those same metropolitan people, Lake Baikal is an undeniable national icon and treasure for the people of the various different Russian states that have gone back. I mean, when would Lake Baikal have been taken? Like in the 1700s? And on top of all of this, Lake Baikal is a UNESCO protected ecosystem. As well, Lake Baikal is one of the purest sources of fresh water on Earth and contains about a fifth of all of the Earth's unfrozen fresh water. So it's safe to say that there's a lot tied up in this lake. A lot of people care about this lake for a lot of different reasons, and they care a lot. So what happens when the Soviet government comes along and decides they're going to hurt the lake? Well, as a big surprise to a number of people, not the least being the Soviet government, the people resist. The people push back. But before we can talk about that, we need to talk a little bit about how we get there. And to do that, we need to go back into the 1920s. The year is 1928, and Joseph Stalin's first 5-year plan has just begun. The goal is to rapidly industrialize the USSR. Land would be cleared, resources would be extracted, factories would be built, and Joseph Stalin would drag the fledgling Soviet Union into the 20th century kicking and screaming. Stalin's 5-year plans were ultimately successful, even if the first one wasn't super successful, in industrializing the Soviet Union and building up the plants, factories, mines, and housing and everything else that you might want to create an industrialized country. But there were terrible consequences for these actions as well. The human cost of the 5-year plans is truly horrific, but that's going to be for a different day. That's not really what we're here to talk about right now. Right now, we're just talking about the environmental consequences, which ain't a whole lot better. Incredibly quickly, swaths of unused and sometimes used land found itself being turned into farms, cities, and industrial centers all over the USSR. And with speed being the number one thing that Stalin's government cared about, little attention was paid to the effects that this industrialization might have on, say, the people it was happening around, or the environment it was happening in. And this happened everywhere, from the farthest western reaches in the border between what is now Ukraine and Poland to the farthest eastern reaches, places like Vladivostok. Industrialization was happening. Factories creating everything from metal railroad ties to dress shoes popped up all over the country, bringing with them the kind of environmental damages that we are so unfortunately familiar with today. But interestingly enough, Lake Baikal was broadly spared. I'm not entirely sure why. Logically, it's a great place for factories and for logging operations. There's a ton of water, which is really important for all kinds of production, and it's really clean water, which means it's even more useful, and there's tons of trees around, so logging is a pretty big no-brainer. But Stalin was not interested in Lake Baikal, and he left the area relatively unbothered. But then, on March 5th, 1953, Stalin changed the world in a way that really only Stalin could, by having a massive stroke and dying. To say Stalin's death was a bit of a big deal is the understatement of a lifetime. The whole country skidded to a fucking halt. Everything was in flux, and no one really knew what to do at that point. But there were some serious eager beavers who knew exactly what needed to be done. Enter the villains of the piece. These would be the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking. These guys had plans, and Joseph Stalin was the only thing standing in their way. They wanted to start logging in areas around Baikal, and then to use the lumber to create paper products. So, well, with the big man out of the way, that's pretty much exactly what they started to do. And things were going pretty well for them at first. These ministries were producing at rapid rates and were being praised and rewarded by the Soviet Central leadership for their good work. But the issue was that they were doing things the same way they always had been. The goal was to rapidly increase production and to industrialize the area. So, this meant they would need to clear huge swaths of forest, build giant paper plants, and then build housing for all the people who were supposed to, clear all the forest and work at the paper plants. And, well, as you might imagine, they paid very, very, very minuscule attention to how they were doing these things and to the damage that they were causing. As well, they weren't even really trying to regrow a lot of the forest that they cut down. And to kind of make things worse, the Baikal ecosystem is particularly fragile. One of the issues is that the soil there is very thin, and it's very hard to replant things. And without the trees there, that soil basically just immediately erodes away. And to make things worse, have you ever heard of lake effect? The kind of very strong storms and winds that come off of places like the Great Lakes? Well, you get that in Lake Baikal too. And so, very high-speed winds come ripping through the area, and they absolutely destroy young trees and low-lying vegetation. Without the larger trees there to protect them, very rapidly a lot of the areas around Lake Baikal start to look pretty barren, especially because, well, even though it is, kind of hard to make all this stuff work, the Ministry of Forestry really doesn't give a shit, and they're not really trying to do anything anyway, so yay. Go them. But at the end of the day, they didn't care. They kind of just saw Siberia as, well, it's there, it's huge, we can't really fuck it up that bad, but that's where they're wrong, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Their mind was on building industry, so they pretty much got right to it. And I mean, why wouldn't they? Up to this point, anyone who'd spoken out against the previous industrialization projects were usually just ignored, and sometimes were even removed from office, and on some occasions were jailed, being called dissidents or nationalists, people who were getting in the way of the USSR's industrialization. And Stalin may be dead, but the goals of industrialization aren't. And it's right after World War II, and the Cold War's in full swing. So who's going to say no to a bunch of logging and paper mills? We have a whole, other superpower out there that we need to compete with, and things like industrialization are very, very important. So the question really becomes, who's going to stand in the way? As it turns out, the people of Lake Baikal are. They're not fucking having it. And they were pretty upset, and they made that known basically immediately as soon as logging began, and as soon as plans for plants were kind of even just drafted. You see, people don't like it when you show up with bulldozers and just start leveling everything all over the place. They especially don't like it when it destroys the ecosystem that they've been living in for hundreds, if not thousands of years at that point. Because as the logging began, the environment began to change pretty rapidly. As I was saying, not only is this bad for the tree growth, it's causing a lot of topsoil to erode. And well, where is this soil going? A lot of it may just get blown away by the wind, but a lot of it goes right into the lake, which causes the lake to become, one, less pure, which to the people there, that's where they're getting their drinking water from, and two, it's really bad for the fish and wildlife population that lives in this lake. And this is just the start of things. I already said that, mills are in the works. They're not there yet, and they're not going to be around for another about 10 years at this point. We're talking right now, like mid-1950s. But people already can tell, like, hey, no, we don't want to deal with that. So the people around Baikal started to take action. They started protesting the construction of housing for workers and of the logging mills, and were continuing to work against the plans to build these paper mills. But these protests were broadly ignored. There's not a ton of people in this area, and they had no real recourse to do anything to stop these ministries. As well, these are people out in Siberia, and their concerns are kind of seen as a little bit less than important. Again, I think I've brought this up before, and if I haven't, well, here we go again. The Soviet Union was a very racist place. A lot of people who kind of idealize the Soviet Union like to think that it wasn't, but it absolutely was. It was very much so a Russia-centric place that carried on a lot of the same kinds of issues and habits that are, racist, just kind of the same kind of racist habits that the Russian Empire had. And people out in Siberia are not exactly seen as quite as important as, say, the folks from Moscow or St. Petersburg. So, broadly speaking, these folks were ignored. But then something happened. Something really fucking stupid. In 1958, there was a conference. The conference was called, and I'm only going to say this once because it's long, the Conference on the Development of Productive Forests in Eastern Siberia. Yikes. At the conference, whose name is too long to be repeated, a man who went by N.A. Grigorovich laid out a plan. Grigorovich was the local head of the Soviet government's nationwide hydroelectric project called Gidroprojekt. Grigorovich was in charge of Gidroprojekt around Baikal. The region around Baikal has a number of rivers and streams that Soviet engineers believed were not being tapped to their full energy potential. They believed that if they created dams along the various rivers that flowed into and out of Baikal, they could create huge amounts of hydroelectric energy. And to be fair, they were already doing that. They were already creating quite a bit of hydroelectric energy. There's quite a lot of fairly strong rivers that lead in and out of Lake Baikal. But Grigorovich was not content. He saw potential for more. So he dreamt up something so ludicrous, so absolutely unfathomably insane, it would be easier to believe that Wile E. Coyote dreamt this up, and not a professional engineer employed by a global superpower. Grigorovich was going to blow up Lake Baikal. I wish this was a joke. Grigorovich's full plan was to plant 30,000 tons of explosives at the mouth of the Angara River, which flows from Lake Baikal. And mind you, The bomb that was dropped over Hiroshima was about 20,000 tons worth of explosive. His plan was to basically nuke Lake Baikal. The plan was that this massive explosion would widen the river and cause it to flow much harder and faster, thus increasing the hydroelectrical potential. The plan was that this massive explosion would widen the river and cause it to flow much harder and faster, thus increasing the hydroelectrical production on the river. And let's just say this idea did not go over well. Before the conference started, Grigorovich thought that the plan was a done deal. He had the support of the Soviet government and most of Gidroprojekt. But as soon as he let the plan loose to the conference, everyone turned against him immediately. Scientists from all different disciplines lined up to give speeches and to discuss just how fucking insane and stupid a plan like this was. People argued the following: this plan would never work on just, so many fucking levels. This would be an economic disaster and the cost could never be recouped. It would be incredibly dangerous to the people doing the project and to the people in the surrounding area. It would demolish the ecosystem of the region, and it would destroy the natural beauty of Lake Baikal and the Angara River, among other issues that people took. Within a few short days, a vote was taken amongst the scientists present at the conference, and they overwhelmingly voted to cancel this plan indefinitely, and they drafted a proposal to send to Moscow requesting more research on the lake and its unique habitat. As it turns out, a large number of the scientists and engineers that were present at the conference were already aware of the damages being done to Lake Baikal and the surrounding areas by the out-of-control logging and the looming threat of the paper mills. And actually, kind of what makes this more interesting is a lot of these people were locals. A lot of these people were from Siberia. A lot of them lived around Lake Baikal even before they were scientists and engineers. So they cared a lot about, the lake. This thing that is so central to not just the ecosystem, but to the lives of the people living there. These folks were already ready to throw down even before the idea of exploding the lake was even brought up. And what stemmed from this refusal of the crazy Looney Tunes plan was a coalition of Soviet scientists who teamed up with Siberian locals to create what is now known as the Baikal Movement. And the Baikal Movement is a really interesting thing. It is not what we normally think of when we think of a movement. It had, and still has, the Baikal Movement is still very much so alive today. No central authority. There were, and are, no leaders and no overarching plans. The movement is made up of a ton of disparate groups who ultimately were and are agitating for a ton of different things, but who all agree on one thing. No one, and I mean no one, touches Lake Baikal. After the start of the Baikal Movement in 1958, the issue of Baikal quickly became a piece of national intrigue. The same scientists who had shut down Grigorovich took to the presses to spread information about what was going on at every Russian's favorite lake. This was done in two ways. One, scientists worked very closely with fiction writers. The scientists would gather data and make projections, and the writers would condense down that information into stories and parables of impending doom. As well, there was an independent movement within Russia's writing community that was focused on Lake Baikal as well. And two, the scientists would openly, in Soviet newspapers and magazines, tell how they disapproved of the actions of Gidroprojekt or the Ministry of Forest or the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking. One such example of this was in 1961 when a Siberian scientist named G.I. Galazi wrote a scathing condemnation of the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking. This article was published in Komsomolskaya Pravda, the state newspaper for kids. Think like Communist Boy's Life. This was a pretty serious breach of normalcy. The Soviet government was being openly criticized by some random dude in their own publication. And not just a random dude, a government employee too. But the government broadly ignored the article and the research that was being provided by Galazi. And other scientists as well were ignored, and their research was broadly just kind of pushed off to the side. Which is unfortunate, because in the same year Galazi threw down the gauntlet, the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking threw down 2 paper plants near the town of Baikalsk. So this is again in 1961. This was a huge blow to the Baikal movement. paper processing uses a lot of water and is a very nasty business that was projected to, and ultimately did, create huge amounts of waste and pollution that would end up in the lake and in the surrounding area. Unfortunately, this was more or less destined to happen, as the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking claimed that these plants were part of an incredibly important military plan. They claimed that the extra clean water of Lake Baikal was necessary to create, quote, supercellulose products, these being high-quality wood pulp products for jet tires. A claim that the people of the time pointed out was dumb because the US was able to create higher quality jet tires and did not in fact have a Lake Baikal of their own. But since this was considered a military project, the details were kept secret, which made it harder for local activists and the scientists to fight back, and it ultimately meant that the plans were bound to come true because if we Americans can commiserate on one thing with the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, it's that if the military wants, the military gets. But I want to make one thing clear. Although these paper plants were ultimately constructed, the public outcry they faced before, during, and after the construction was immense. The entire Soviet Union seemed to have taken up the cause of the lake. Shortly after Galazi's article was published, the magazine Literaturna Gazeta, which translates to the literary magazine, very creative guys, published another scathing write-up of the Ministry of Forestry and the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking, which was followed up by yet another attack by Komsomolskaya Pravda, this time all on their own without Galazi supporting them. These magazine publications, as well as the works of environmentally minded writers, were incredibly moving to the Soviet citizenry. Something you may or may not know about Russia and the Soviet Union is that Russia is, and the Soviet Union was, a very literary society. Russian novelists and poets such as Lermontov, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, and Tolstoy are national heroes and treasures on the same way as any military leader or political hero. And for many, the literary greats are kind of in a league all of their own. Fiction in particular has always been a reflection of the Russian soul, and at this time in the late 50s and early 1960s, the Russian soul and the fiction of the era cared a lot about one thing: Lake Baikal. The Soviet citizenry took in all the literature being put out in every form and turned that anger into articles in their own local newspapers, and even in national newspapers. Letters to the editors would show up by the thousands to local and national newspapers demanding the government do something to protect the lake. Then they started writing their own representatives with the same demands. At the same time, lobbying groups that included scientists, engineers, naturalists, and general concerned Russian citizens put pressure on government officials to do something. And I'd like to take a moment to point out how truly amazing this is. This is the USSR of the late 1950s and early 1960s. The people of the USSR had been through a lot in the roughly 40 years their country had been in existence. And a lot of that they've been through had been at the hands of their own government. Millions of people over that time had been killed, arrested, or deported as punishment for a number of things even less threatening than a letter-writing campaign. Now, to be very fair, the USSR of the 1960s was not the USSR of the 1940s, and Khrushchev, who was in charge of the USSR at this time and who took power after Stalin, made a very concerted effort to make the USSR more relaxed and open to dissent and public discussion. But it was still the USSR, and Stalin had only died in 1953. The USSR still absolutely did not foster a free and open political society, and the horrors of the Stalin regime were not so long ago that anyone would forget. So, even with all of that in mind, the people of the USSR still said, fuck it. They were willing to put their jobs, their freedoms, and arguably even their lives in danger to protect Lake Baikal, and called Gidroprojekt, the Ministry of Forestry, and the Ministry of Timber, Paper, and Woodworking out on their bullshit. The citizens of the Soviet Union had decided that this was a bridge too far. To the people of the Soviet Union, Lake Baikal was something akin to the Grand Canyon in the way, Americans think of it. It is a natural symbol so near and dear to the heart of millions that to cause it any damage whatsoever is truly unthinkable. Think about that for a moment. Imagine that the US government wanted to fill in part of the Grand Canyon in order to create a mine or a chemical plant or whatever. Think about how the American people would react. So, quickly, the drive to defend the lake became a cause célèbre in a way that nothing else had, even though this was certainly not even close to the first time the Soviet government had violated the ecological stability of an area or caused irreparable environmental damage. And this is where things start to really get interesting. The scientists are creating data, the writers are processing it, the populace at large is petitioning the government to stop, and the locals are protesting the government in person. And remember, this is all being done without any kind of central organization. The groups that sprung up in the 1950s and 60s to defend the lake sprung up on their own and carried out their various operations oftentimes with limited, if any, support from any of the other organizations. This was truly just a massive upspringing of public sentiment that ultimately the government just couldn't ignore. Yep, you heard me right. The government, the Soviet government, was forced to take action. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the Soviet government and how it worked. If you were like me, you were raised on the concept that the Soviet government was a simple dictatorship where whatever the guy in charge said went. And in some ways, that was true, especially when Stalin was in power. But this isn't really how it worked, especially now that Stalin's dead. As we have already seen earlier in this episode, there are ministries, and these ministries are pretty similar to the departments and bureaus that make up the US government. They have oversight over sometimes fairly broad goals, like the Ministry of Forestry, for example. There's a lot that is tied up in forestry, and a lot of things forestry impacts, and that impacts forestry. So ultimately, you end up with a lot of ministries, and their powers and duties kind of overlap. So what this looks like in our situation here in Baikal is that the ministries of forestry and timber, paper, and woodworking are all doing all this forestry, timber, paper, and woodworking shit, and guess what? They're starting to make enemies within the government. Enter the Ministry of Fishing. And the Ministry of Fishing says, holy shit, have y'all read these reports coming out of the Baikal region? Man, these are bad. All the fucking fish are dying. Maybe you could, slow up a little bit. And the Ministries of Forestry, Timber, Paper, and Woodworking got together, and they drafted a response. The response was, no. So, things continued on. But the enemies of the exploiters were mounting. A good example of this was the 23rd Party Congress in 1966. The representative Mikhail Shokolov said, quote, without exaggeration, one can say that Baikal belongs not only to us, but also to our descendants, the people of the epoch of communism. In the new Eden that communism would be, it is inconceivable that Lake Baikal would not be there. I cannot think of a better way to put it myself. Whether or not the people of the Soviet Union believed or cared about communism, that quote, I think, expresses the thoughts of the public perfectly. There is no Soviet Union, or Russia, or even the politics that sustain the concept of those states, without such an item so central to their identity as Lake Baikal. This kind of backlash, no one was expecting it. Remember, Gidroprojekt thought their plan, which had been thoroughly killed at this point, was going to sweep through the 1958 convention without much of a response, and the various ministries pillaging the Baikal countryside, who were originally rewarded for their efforts, never foresaw anyone, certainly not the entire country, rising up against them. But here we are. Specifically, here we are in the year 1971. And finally, the efforts of the scientists, activists, politicians, and the Ministry of Fishing were going to pan out. In 1971, the USSR People's Control Committee, a disciplinary arm of the Soviet government, passed down guidelines to the ministries of forestry, timber, paper, and woodworking to reduce the damage that they were causing. The People's Control Committee started watching these ministries more closely and began to tighten their control over the ministries in order to help protect the fish populations in Lake Baikal. But if you are familiar with government, the Soviet one, the American one, any of them, then you know that this is quite a bit easier said than done. The rogue ministry's looting of Lake Baikal had a lot of time, energy, and money tied up in these projects, and they were making huge returns on these efforts. They were not about to stop now. So they did what any good government does. Ignore the other facet of the government and just do whatever the hell you want. This actually caused a pretty serious rift between the ministries of forestry, timber, paper, and woodworking and the rest of the central government. They were seen as rogue ministries who couldn't be trusted or controlled. And as the Soviet Union trundled through the 1970s, they continued to duke it out with these ministries, but ultimately they could do very little to effectively slow them down. And this process more or less carried out until the collapse of the USSR. People still protested around the lake, and scientists still begged for something to be done, and people continued to show their support for the lake, but there was ultimately very little that they could do to force the government's hand. Then the 1990s came, and the Soviet Union was no more. The 1990s saw the death of the Soviet Union and the rapid privatization of industry all over the country. As the 1990s turned to the 2000s, much of Russia's natural resources had already been snatched up by Russia's new elite, the oligarchs. And much like in the Soviet times, Siberia offered tons of natural resources for those who were willing to go there and crack open the earth to find it. And this time, there would be maybe arguably even less environmental concern. Don't get me wrong, the Soviet Union has some truly spectacular attacks on nature under its belt, but the Russian Federation certainly isn't going to give a flying fuck about some giant lake somewhere. No. Pipelines to transport oil and natural gas were being constructed. Rail lines were to be created, and ancient Soviet ones were to be improved. And still, trees were to be chopped down and turned into paper on the shores of Lake Baikal. But never fear. Where there's ecological destruction, there is the Baikal Movement. As of news time today, that being August 24th, 2024, the Baikal Movement is still going and going strong. It is very much so the same movement that it has always been. There is still no centralized leadership, and it spans the entire country. And depending on where you are in the country, the tactics and style of protest engagement vary wildly. Now, instead of taking to newspapers, the people of Russia take to the internet to create blogs and websites detailing the environmental mismanagement that is occurring, and to highlight the rampant corruption of the Russian state, while locals take more direct actions such as protests, blocking construction projects, and even sometimes fighting with the Russian police. At its core, this is the beauty of the Baikal Movement. Each person that engages is engaging in their own way. Many of the groups that take up the mantle of defending Lake Baikal have little politically, materially, or in mindset in common with the others that make up the movement, other than the desire to protect the world's deepest lake and one of Russia's prized natural wonders. There have been attempts to centralize the movement, but they've always ended in failure, not because the people cannot work together, but because they prefer their decentralized, multifaceted approach. This does lead to some interesting issues where sometimes some groups might be willing to go to a little bit more greater extremes than others. But broadly speaking, the Baikal movement is a peaceful movement that many people still think of with a lot of respect. And as well, their decentralized nature is a useful defense mechanism. When the Russian authorities do crack down, their punishments do little to slow down the movement, as the dissolution or arrest of a single group means very little to the broader movement. Though, unfortunately, the Baikal movement has not been a particularly successful one. As I've laid out, during the Soviet times and now, the powers that have been and be never really slowed down all too much in their efforts to exploit the natural resources in and around Lake Baikal. So, why do I even bring it up? Kind of a bummer, don't you think? Kind of seems like I've dragged you along this whole time just to tell you that it was all futile and that the good guys were crushed under the boot heel of the man. What the hell, man? But no, I disagree with that entire line of thinking entirely. Even if the successes of the Baikal movement are limited and have not ultimately saved the lake, they are helping. They do serve to slow down the gears of the Russian Federation as much as they serve to slow down the gears of the Soviet government. And more importantly, really what this story is it's not a story about what they were able to achieve or what they weren't able to achieve. This is a story about how a grassroots group of random citizens banded together and have stuck together in some way or another for over 60 years in the face of government oppression and repression, and have made their voices heard. The people of Russia are always seen as servile and willing to just do as they're told. Here in the quote-unquote West, we are always thinking of ourselves as the free peoples, and that the people of other parts of the world just kind of accept their lot in life. But that's bullshit. It's bullshit that we made up just to make ourselves feel special. The West does not have a monopoly on those who stand up against tyranny and oppression. This is why I like to highlight protests and even revolutionary movements of Russia and the Soviet Union. We don't like to think of them in America, oftentimes just because we don't know of them. At best, we think of the Russians as unfortunate victims of the various governments that have occupied the halls of power in the region. At worst, we think of them as willing followers who just do as they're told and who know no other way than that of despotism. We never truly acknowledge the agency that the Russian individuals have as human beings, as actors, and we never treat them with the respect that they deserve. So, let's put some respect on the name of the Baikal Movement, and to all of the courageous people who stuck their necks out and are still sticking their necks out to defend one of Earth's greatest treasures. Thank you all for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed this discussion of the Baikal Movement. If you did enjoy it, or even if you didn't, please do not hesitate to leave me a comment, and don't forget to follow the show on whatever platform you're listening on. Comments and following really help grow the show, and it really helps the show reach more people. And of course, I want you guys to tell me what you think, so that way I can improve on things. As well, I have some exciting news. Or, well, I guess it's not entirely news, but it's news to you guys. Beneath the Red Star has an Instagram page. It has for a little while now, basically since the very beginning, but I just got around to promoting it because I'm a true professional. You can follow the show at BTRS Pod on Instagram, no spaces. There I will be posting updates about the show, info about upcoming episodes, occasionally pictures of my cats as they help me record and edit, and as supplemental items to add some info to the show. For this week's show, I've put together some info about Lake Baikal on there, as well as some pictures of me when I visited in 2018. So please check it out. But with that, it's time for this to come to a close. Thank you all again for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.